And with that, Dave, it's all yours. Thanks for joining us. I appreciate you being here.
Okay, thank you, Pete. Always good to be here too. So appreciate everybody joining us today. Just a bit of background about myself. I'm with Penn State Extension. Been with Penn State for almost 20 years now. My background is around this topic here, competing vegetation. I did my master's work on herbicides and competition control, wrote publication and created a web resource as well. So I've done a lot of work in this area. My background also I'm from New York State, originally from the Rochester area, and graduated from SUNY, did my master's degree here at Penn State. And so with that, we'll go ahead and get started here. As Peter said, we're going to talk about ferns today, controlling understory fern competition, particularly as it centers around regenerating hardwood forests. And so we often see these fern understories like you see in this image here, and most of us think that they're just beautiful, and there's a public perception certainly around that this is just picturesque beauty, and it is, but most people don't understand why we have the fern understories and really what some of the problems are that they're causing. In reality, these fern understories like this can be and have been described as biological deserts, lacking plants and wildlife diversity, provide little food and cover for wildlife, and ultimately, and the topic that we're really going to focus on today, is threaten sustainability of our hardwood forest resources by inhibiting regeneration success. And so let's look at this a little more detail. So the question that I posed to you, are all ferns a problem? And of course, the answer is no. And we generally lump ferns into two just basic categories, and I call them clump ferns or single frond ferns. So what I have pictured here are a number of different species of what we call clump ferns. So that just means that where the fronds emerge from the ground, you can see in all of these images here, there are a number of different fronds that come from that same point or come from a clump. So these are things like wood ferns, ostrich ferns, Christmas ferns, cinnamon ferns, lady ferns. So a number of different species that we describe as clump ferns, and these generally aren't problematic. The other broad category of ferns that we describe are what we call single frond ferns. So that means that they send up individual fronds along their root system. And these are species like hay-scented fern, New York fern, and bracken fern. And these can be very common fern, but these single frond ferns can be very problematic because, as you see in this picture of hay-scented fern, for example, they can create very dense understories. And so here's a picture of the rhizome. So the rhizome is the root system. So we can describe these ferns as rhizomatous ferns. And along that rhizome or root system, you can see little buds here. And each one of these is where a frond will ultimately grow off of that rhizome or that root system. So they describe it as a dichotomous forking rhizome. So as that rhizome grows through the soil, it forks periodically and sends up individual fronds off that same root system. And if you harvest that forest and bring sunlight into the forest floor. Now, these are shade-tolerant plants, but they grow really well in the sun, and many of you have probably experienced this, that they just get thicker once you bring that sunlight in there. And they describe that as the rhizome is growing faster and produces rhizome buds, which grow up very rapidly in that sunlight. So we describe these as rhizomatous ferns, hay-scented, New York, bracken fern. We're going to describe each one of these. So here's hay-scented fern. So the frond or the leaf on hay-scented fern is lance-shaped or triangular shaped in general. It's thrice cut, and I want to try to describe that to you. So what that means is that the stem is 3 times divided. So if you look in this image in the lower left here, this is the main stem of the frond. So that's divided by these individual leaves, I'll say. And then you have the stem here, and that stem is also divided by these individual smaller leaflets. And then those individual leaflets are also divided. And so that's one way you can learn to identify hay-scented fern. So it's going to send up a single frond, typically triangular shape, and have these leaflets that are 3 times cut. And then, of course, the odor, and that's where it gets its name. A lot of people describe that as being fresh cut hay. And that one is different from New York fern in that this fern is typically widest in the center, as you see in the image here, but it's only twice cut. So the little leaflets on these side branches don't have that third cut in that. And one way you might remember this is I've heard people just say that New Yorkers burn the candle on both ends, or if you turn it sideways, I like to describe that as the New York City skyline in the center there. So those are the large buildings. So typically you'll see that characteristic shape with New York fern in that it's only twice cut. Otherwise, the way New York and hay-scented fern spread in understories look very similar. And the last one is bracken fern. This one's not nearly as problematic as the other two, but I have seen dense understories of bracken fern as well. But it is a rhizomatous fern, triangular shaped. You can see this looking downwards on here, these 3 triangles. You can see them here, 1, 2, and 3. So there's 3 branches, and each of those being triangular shaped. So that's bracken fern. And again, it sends up just a single frond from that root system. So this is just to give you an idea of the land area that we have covering the state of Pennsylvania. So the green area represents the percentage of our state that is in forest land. We're about 60% forested, very similar to New York State. And then if I give you the yellow area, that's the percentage of our forest understories that are dominated by fern. This is 2007 data, but 5,800 square miles that are fern dominated, 3.7 million acres, or just over 20% of our total forest area. So I don't know what the dominance is in New York State. I haven't seen a lot in Western New York, but I have seen some places in the Adirondacks that are starting to become more problematic with fern dominance in the understories. So why so much fern? And this is an image that I took here in central Pennsylvania following a harvest. And really the explanation is that it's because of high white-tailed deer populations. And you can see this is on a demonstration area in a state forest, and there's a fenced-in area right here in the center of this fern meadow. This was a forest that was harvested, the fence was installed here, and you can see the only place that we got tree regeneration was inside that fence. Here's another example on more of a commercial type of operation here where we have tree regeneration inside the fence and nothing but fern on the outside of the fence. So we need to understand that deer are selective browsers. So they're browsing our native hardwood seedlings, blackberry and raspberry, herbaceous forbs, but they don't eat fern. So this selective or preferential browser allows the non-preferred plants like fern to proliferate and spread in our understories. And ultimately, our forest understories, where we have really high deer impact, and I'll define that for you in a minute, can become dominated by species that deer avoid. And so typically I like to get people away from talking about high deer numbers, because in reality what we're talking about is high deer impact. And I define deer impact in forest as deer, let's describe it with high deer impact. So that is when deer are reducing seedling numbers, they're shifting seedling species composition to those that they don't prefer, and they're reducing seedling height growth. So in an area with high deer impact, seedling numbers will be reduced, seedling height growth will be reduced, and the understory will be dominated by species that deer avoid or that they don't eat. So that's how we define deer impact, particularly as it relates to hardwood regeneration. And so in areas with high deer impact, this is some of the species that we'll find dominating forest understories. And these are 2 images that I took here in Pennsylvania. This image on the left is an understory that's completely dominated by bracken fern. And then this is another one that I took here. This is hay-scented fern. But some other species that you'll find dominating forest understories where deer impact is high. Grasses, we're seeing more and more of Japanese stiltgrass becoming a problem here. And some research has tied that directly to high deer impact. Blueberry, huckleberry, mountain laurel, sweet fern, spice bush, beech, striped maple, ironwood. In particular, ironwood, I talked specific about Ostraya or eastern hop hornbeam as I describe it. So that's the common name. So we'll find those plants dominating understories when deer impact is high. So we call these plants interfering plants. We call them interfering plants because they interfere or inhibit the establishment and growth of desirable tree seedlings by forming this dense sub-canopy that shades the forest floor. And this is an image taken from looking up through fern. So imagine if you were a seed that fell on the forest floor and you had to try and germinate, grow, and develop beneath this shade. That shade, the quantity and quality of light coming through that fern canopy in and of itself is inhibiting enough to prevent that regeneration process from occurring. So here's another image where you can really see how dark and shady it is underneath this dense fern canopy. And that alters that quality and quantity of light. So the quality of light is based on those ferns absorbing that green light, and then the quality, it's just the amount of light, or quantity is, and that's just the amount of light reaching the forest floor is tremendously reduced. So here's a couple of studies that I'll show you the results from. So these were done by our friends at the U.S. Forest Service at the Northern Research Station, and it demonstrated fern interference and how it reduced seedling numbers as well as seedling height growth. And so both of these studies were done inside fences up in the Allegheny region of Pennsylvania, northwest Pennsylvania. And the one on the left here is the number of desirable seedlings. So these areas started at the same point, but where they weeded fern out of this particular site here, the seedling numbers greatly increased. And over time, where fern was left in place, even inside deer exclosures, the numbers of seedling greatly declined. And then they looked at its impact on seedling height growth as well. And here it is in the presence of fern within a deer fence even, that it only grew, I think it was 11 inches over a 5-year period of time, where when the fern and grass was removed, the cherry trees grew over 55 inches on average in that same 5-year period of time. So tremendous difference in the presence of fern versus without fern. So we know now that seedling numbers are reduced anywhere between 50 and 90% in the presence of fern, and seedling height growth reduced anywhere from 40 to 65%. So tremendous interference in fern alone, even without deer being present. So that's something that's really telling about the impact that fern in general can have. But there are two primary limiting factors. So deer browsing and shade. So shade from that vegetation strata that's beneath the main overstory canopy are the two most important factors limiting regeneration. So for example, you could come into an area like this and you could eliminate that fern regeneration or that fern canopy. But if you didn't address the deer problem here, you might just end up with the same situation ultimately over time. So you really have to look at this as a kind of a two-pronged approach and make sure that you're assessing what the impact of the deer are going to be, and if it's going to be a problem, that you're mitigating that in some way. So when these two situations exist, and the situations are high deer impact and dense low shade, so dense low shade and high deer impact, then advanced regeneration of shade intolerant species like black cherry, white ash, yellow poplar, and intermediate tolerant species like red maple, black birch, yellow birch, northern red oak, white oak does not occur. And if the shade is too dense, then shade tolerant species do not occur even. So sugar maple, hemlock might even be inhibited if the shade from those interfering plants is too dense. So when interfering plants become moderately dense, and will describe the word moderately because a lot of the research focused around this 30% figure. So they would say that if you were to do an inventory of the understory and 30% of your plots had at least 30% fern coverage, it's likely that fern is going to dominate that understory following the harvest. So 30% was generally that threshold, that cutoff to say, yeah, I need to address it, or no, it's probably not going to be an issue. And so do your inventory, see what percentage of your understory is covered with fern, and address the problem if you need to, but we'll describe that as that moderately dense. And you must remove the interference before the regeneration process can continue. And so this work was done by the U.S. Forest Service. The early work was actually started in the mid-1970s and became operational even in the late 1970s. And they looked at everything from using herbicides to prescribed fire to even mechanical removal. And they found that mechanical removal was just impractical. Mowing didn't work. It actually would just cause the fern to resprout. There was no way to remove it by hand. Prescribed burning was the same way. They actually found it actually promoted fern development. So where they landed was on the use of herbicides, and they found that herbicides were effective, they were economical, and they were a safe means of removing interfering plants, not just fern, but many of the other interfering plants that we spoke about earlier, particularly in areas that are impacted by deer. And they focused on a number of different herbicides, but ultimately landed on glyphosate. And all the early work that they looked at used Roundup. And so Roundup and glyphosate, the active ingredient, is found in many other products today, Rodeo, Accord, and many other generic brands. You see one listed there, the Ranger products from New Farm. But Roundup is essentially Rodeo, which is the non-generic aquatic labeled glyphosate product. It's basically Rodeo with a surfactant added to it. And they found that Roundup or glyphosate controlled ferns, it controlled grasses, sedges, striped maple, and beech. So it truly was a broad spectrum herbicide, which is how glyphosate is described. It's not specific to any particular class of plants. It'll control everything from grasses to trees. And I know what you're all thinking as soon as I said glyphosate or Roundup, because I'm sure many of you have seen the ads on TV to get in on the lawsuits, but I will tell you the latest findings here, and Penn State is still recommending and using glyphosate products. This was released from our Environmental Protection Agency in January of this year. So I'll read this. The EPA released the interim decision for registration review. As part of this action, the EPA continues to find that there are no risks of concern to human health when glyphosate is used in accordance with its current label. EPA also found that glyphosate is unlikely to be a human carcinogen. So I find this very frustrating and confusing in the sense, because I think it's clearly one of those things where the science doesn't match what is ongoing in the courts. And so based on the science and some other studies, which I'm not going to quote to you today, and the fact that it's not just our EPA, but it's also Canada, European Union, and many others came to the same conclusion, we're still recommending the use of glyphosate products. So how does glyphosate work? So when the plant intakes the herbicide, glyphosate, it actually blocks the formation of essential amino acids that are only found in plants. So that's one of the reasons its mode of action is so benign to animals. It's because those amino acids are not found in animal systems. So it doesn't have a mode of action to work on in animal systems, and has a lethal dose value that makes it practically non-toxic. It's greater than 5,000 milligrams per kilogram. We don't even know what it is. We just know it's greater than 5,000. And so it's very non-toxic. In fact, if you looked at the personal protection equipment required on many glyphosate labels, it doesn't even require you to wear rubber gloves. So if you looked at that rodeo product, for example, it doesn't have rubber gloves even required on the label. It's just long sleeve shirt, long pants, shoes, and socks. But glyphosate is absorbed through the leaf cuticle, and then it's translocated using the xylem and the phloem that you see here to the site of action, which are photosynthetic cells in the chloroplast. And then the mechanism of action is that it actually inhibits photosynthesis from occurring, and ultimately the plant shuts down and dies. This does require that the plant is growing actively. So if a plant is not growing, then the chemical is not translocated throughout the plant. So these are the guidelines that the Forest Service studies came up with. And so this is using glyphosate at 1 to 1.5 quarts per acre, and it gives you the optimum dates. So looking at June, July, August, and September. Grasses and sedges throughout that whole window until about mid-September, when the season starts to end or you start to get the plant shutting down or becoming dormant. Hay-scented New York fern, mid-July to mid-September. Bracken fern later in the season. And then beech and STM is striped maple again later in the season. They found better control using glyphosate. So herbicide timing was important though. Early season fern control, they found if the fern was not fully developed yet, so it hadn't completely grown, hadn't completely unfurled its leaves, they didn't get as good a control on it as they did once they got into July. And then late season applications, they found some constraints too, because its leaves started to turn yellow. And again, remember that mode of action, the plant has to be actively growing in order to move that glyphosate to where the mode of action can occur. So if they're yellowing, it's typically that you won't get good control. So the guideline is don't apply when greater than 25% of the foliage is yellowed. They did find some early problems with glyphosate prescriptions though. So the fern control was inadequate in vehicle tracks. So what they found was when track machines or rubber tire machine were driving through the ferns, they were not only breaking the frond off the rhizome, but they were actually physically breaking the rhizome itself. And if the rhizome wasn't connected to foliage, or wasn't connected to another rhizome that had a frond attached to it, and it was maybe just a separate fragment, it actually would re-sprout. They had a lot of problems with the regrowth of grass and sedge from seed bank that was stored in the soil, and they did find a little bit an inadequate control of striped maple, which was more of a coverage issue. You really had to get full coverage on maples, and maples in general are relatively tolerant of glyphosate herbicide. So full coverage on the striped maples we found was really critical. So this is some images showing you the fern tracks and then isolated plants. So you can see where the machinery, where the machinery drove through the woods here, broke those rhizomes. This was in year 1 where the fern came up in those tracks. Year 2, and by year 3, it had just completely grown in where it didn't get controlled in those tracks. And then they found places occasionally, and I'll show you an image too, where there's just an isolated frond or two for whatever reason. It might have just gotten broken off or whatever, but they did find a few isolated plants to be problematic as well. So they went back to the drawing board. Oh, and here's another one actually showing the residual seed bank that's completely ineffective. So if you have grass and sedge seeds in the soil, those seeds are not controlled by glyphosate herbicides. They have to be germinated. There has to be foliage there for the herbicide to move through that foliage to control the roots. But if it's just seed that germinates after the treatment, there's no effect on that from glyphosate herbicides because it has no soil residual activity. It can't be taken up by roots. So they went back to the drawing board and they looked at a number of other products to see if they could solve some of the fern track issues, some of the residual seed bank issues with grasses and sedges, and they landed on this active ingredient, sulfometuron. So this is the active ingredient in products like Oust XP, Spider, a lot of generic brands like SFM 75 and many others. So all the early work used Oust. It wasn't even Oust XP at the time. It was just called Oust. They found that this product was very good at controlling annual and perennial grasses as well as broadleaf weeds. it does have a short-term residual activity. So a lot of people describe it as a pre-emergent herbicide, but it is not a true pre-emergent herbicide. It doesn't act on seed germination, but it has soil residual activity, which means that it's soil active. So when a seed germinates in the soil, it picks up the herbicide that's there, and then it controls the plant that way. So it has a short term. The half-life is only about 28 days. And so after about 5 half-lives, about 5 months, let's say, the herbicide is completely gone from the site, having broken down. And then they've also found, which is great, that there was little to no damage to hardwood seedlings. So if you had advanced desirable seedling regeneration in the understory, you could put sulfometuron right over top of it with no damage to those seedlings. So here's the guidelines that they came up with. Optimum dates at 2 ounces per acre using sulfometuron or oust. And they found using, if you had hay-scented or New York fern, again, it was that July to early October until the fern started to yellow. Gave you a little bit longer window now because you had that soil residual working in your favor. And then seed banks of grass and sedge you could apply earlier. I've even found with Japanese stiltgrass, we could even apply it during the dormant season and still have that soil residual. So I would even extend that out even into April, May without any trouble if you're particularly looking at controlling a seed bank for grass control. It's not been shown to control fern early season. So they found the fern has to be emerged before it's controlled. Let's see, ferns, good control in no fern tracks or isolated fronds. Grasses, selective, some controlled, some not. Seed bank emergence was 2/3 to 3/4 less when they put oust down, and then the same thing on the sedge emergence, but sedges were poorly controlled. So if you have a site that has a lot of sedges, oust is actually selective to it, and it will leave the sedges on site. So here's what some of the plots look like. So you can see the no spray. Here's at 2 ounces per acre. All the fern is controlled. Hardwoods left. Same thing here, 3 ounces per acre, 4 ounces per acre, and this is a July treatment. Here's the August treatment. Again, no spray. Ferns controlled at 2 ounces, 3 ounces, or 4 ounces. Even at 4 ounces, hardwood seedlings were left in place. September treatments, 2 ounces, fern controlled, and even up to 4 ounces fern controlled, and I can even see some oak seedlings here left in place. And so here's some of their summary observations here. So all 3 rates and times were effective on fern control. And they list the seedlings there. Seedlings of red maple, white oak, red maple, sugar maple, striped maple, beech, white ash, cherry, serviceberry, birch, cucumber magnolia, and yellow poplar all survived. Now rubus, which is blackberry and raspberries, and grasses were killed. And I will give you a forewarning too, using sulfometuron or oust or any of the generic brands, if you have your favorite wildflowers there, they will likely be controlled with those treatments. And so not just grasses, but other broadleaf types of wildflower understory plants would be controlled using sulfometuron. September results were the most variable. Some sites had yellow ferns when they were treated, and so we lost some control when fern yellowing occurred. And the July treatment resulted in more leaf formations on the hardwood seedlings. So I found that early season applications of oust when the trees are just budding out and you have that new succulent growth, it's probably not the best time to be putting oust down or sulfometuron. It's either going to be down as a pre-emergent before bud break or wait until July to make your applications. So here's some of the optimum application rates and dates, whether we're using glyphosate or sulfometuron. And so glyphosate is 1 to 1.5 quarts per acre, so 1 to 1.5 quarts. Grasses and sedges can be applied early as June, right onto mid-September. Hay-scented fern or New York fern, we're waiting until July to mid-September, and then bracken, fern, beech, and striped maple are August to mid-September applications. If we're looking at sulfometuron, you only need 2 ounces per acre, and our fern applications are going to be starting in July, right on through September, even into early October, because we have that soil residual. And then grasses and sedges, trying to control that seed bank, June through September. And again, I think you can even go applications, particularly work that I've looked at with Japanese stiltgrass, can be done as a pre-emergent even in April or May. So here's some of the site-specific recommendations. So most situations, you're going to use glyphosate plus sulfometuron mixed together. For ferns only, the recommendation is just to use sulfometuron. They found it was very effective at controlling ferns alone. If you have ferns plus grass and sedge seed bank, like a lot of our sites now are fern with Japanese stiltgrass, for example, we're using sulfometuron alone or glyphosate plus sulfometuron. And then sites that have striped maple and beech, you have to use glyphosate because the sulfometuron does not control those woody species at all. So how are these herbicide applications made for fern control? So we either use ground-based air blast sprayer, like these big machine, whether they're skidder mounted or track machine mounted. I'll show you some other images here in a moment. Backpack mist blowers, which are motorized mist blowers, and then even just a general backpack sprayer, if you have small infestations, works just fine to get these out. So this is a picture of Forest Regeneration Services air blast sprayer. This is a track machine treating the fern understory prior to the site being harvested. It has a bulldozer type blade on the front so it can push over small trees and try to systematically go back and forth through these units applying. You can see the stacked nozzles here spraying out the side as well as the back after it drives through those ferns. So you can see how a lot of these fronds are going to be broken with these kinds of tracks. And so it's important, if you're treating this was likely sulfometuron treatment so that they were getting good control of that fern. And I'll actually show you a picture of this site later on after it was treated. So air blast sprayers, as I said, they have that vertical stack of nozzles. They can even shut off one side and go around the perimeter of a property just spraying inwards, and that's how they normally start, to just spray off one side. It can spray also out the back using these nozzles here. You can see it right there, spraying out here and right here. So it's getting the stuff that it's driving over and breaking down onto the ground. It can spray trees up to 20 feet high. So if you have targets in there that are taller than that, it's likely that you're going to have to go back and do some cleanup work, whether with basil bark treatments or hack and squirt herbicide treatments to get some of the taller vegetation controlled. It's called an air blast sprayer because it generates 120 mile per hour wind from the fan to break the herbicide and the solution into these small size particles and blast it through the vegetation. Depending on the density of the vegetation, though, it can penetrate very well, and you can treat a swath anywhere from 40 to 80 feet wide, as you see in this image here, where they were showing and calibrating the machine. But you can see how wide of a swath that it can take out in an open environment. Now imagine that in a dense beech brush or striped maple understory, you're not getting nearly that width of a swath. So backpack mist blowers and backpack sprayers can also be very effective, particularly if you're dealing with just small infestations or small patches in your woodlands that you want to treat. So these are motorized machines. So you have a motor here that's fueled. You have a tank that sits on top of it, very top heavy, very difficult to get through the woods, but can be very effective because you can take out a pretty wide swath with that. Again, this is something that you need to make sure you're flagging where you're going, flagging where you've been. You know how wide your swath is so that you're not getting overlap. And same with this, just using a flat fan nozzle on this, you're taking out a certain width swath as you systematically cross back and forth through fern patches. So you're looking for even coverage, spray to wet, not to the point of runoff. I actually find using a nozzle like this, just a handheld nozzle that I'm moving back and forth in front of me as I'm walking. I typically wear chaps when I do this kind of work, but I can be very effective taking out even as wide as a 10-foot swath with the right nozzle, an adjustable cone nozzle on something like that handheld wand. And then this is kind of an interesting setup here. So this is Dale Garricky. He actually modified a leaf blower. So the engine is mounted on his back and he pressurizes a tank with the herbicide solution that he carries on his front and then injects that spray into the end of the leaf blower and blasts it out there. So he can take out a really wide swath, treating invasive plants or fern or whatever it might be. You know, and again, here's a backpack mist blower going through a fern understory, systematically covering that understory. So be sure to calibrate. Really important that you understand these rates that I'm giving you are not just put so much in a gallon of water and go out and spray. These are calibrated rates. So if you're going to take your backpack sprayer or you're going to buy a mist blower and go out and treat, it's important that you're treating at that 1 to 2 quarts per acre using glyphosate or that 2 to 4 ounces with the sulfometuron. So understand how to calibrate. This is my Forest Science fact sheet, backpack sprayer calibration for woodland applications. It'll walk you through exactly how to do that for band type of treatment. So you're taking out a band, which is a certain width as you walk systematically back and forth through these patches of fern. And so that's how you would start in your calibration process. But it's a very simple process that walks you through some real examples using 2 ounces of ounce per acre, for example, and it shows you exactly how to do the math to do the calibration exercise. So raspberries and blackberries can circumvent the need to use herbicides for fern control. So they found if blackberry, Rubus briars can get up through fern, they can actually crowd out fern and ultimately act as this natural fern control. So the soil disturbance is what stimulates Rubus or raspberry and blackberry briars to germinate from the seed bank that's in the soil. And over time, that Rubus has been found that it can eliminate ferns. The problem is that deer eat the Rubus, so you must protect the Rubus from deer. So if you can't get Rubus to grow, then you're just going to end up with the fern. So you really have to understand what's going on in that woods and know what the deer impact is. So I'll give you a few examples here of before and after shots. So this is a site that was tremendously impacted by deer. They got in one of these golden wing warbler programs. So the site was ultimately fenced and the understory was treated so that they could get regeneration to occur here. There was literally no seedling regeneration in this understory. It had been this way for years, where it was just dominated by fern. Tremendous high deer impact in this area. It can be quite dramatic after you run an air blast sprayer through that understory. That's what it looked like after it was treated. You still do see some individual fronds popping up here. I'm not positive what the mixture that was used on this treatment. It was not a prescription that I was involved in. I do know that Japanese stiltgrass came in on this site afterwards, and it was treated again using just sulfometuron. And so you need to be prepared if this is something that you're considering to see what this is going to look like after that first year. I have found, though, that following the second growing season, you will see a dramatic change in these areas. Just look amazing after the second growing season. You wouldn't even recognize that it had been treated. This is the same site that I showed you with the big air blast machine from Forest Regeneration Services. And so this is what the fern looked like after they had gone through there. And again, this was prior to the site being harvested. You do see It was selective. You see some little green seedlings still present in the understory that were protected underneath that fern canopy or weren't harmed because they just used sulfometuron in the prescription there. But you can see the trees are marked for harvest. You see the yellow paint there. And so the first stage of the shelterwood cut was likely going to occur after this was treated. So my typical recommendation is for folks, and I know this isn't always possible because many of you have already harvested and now you have a fern problem, but if you have a fern understory, the ideal situation would be to control that fern and then let in the sunlight and then do your harvest. And so control the fern before you cut. Here's just another example that was treated with an air blast sprayer. So you can see that dense low shade on the untreated side here to my left, and then just treating it with a herbicide, and you can see how much more light's coming in here. So this was the treated, so it's that treated from that ground layer up to that 15 or 20 feet was controlled, and that was enough to let in a tremendous amount of light. And that's what the understory looked like. It was just a carpet of black cherry new germinants once that light was allowed to reach the forest floor. So they're having more difficulties now with getting cherry regeneration, but this isn't typical any longer from what I'm understanding, but this shows you how controlling that interference and letting that sunlight in can have a dramatic effect on what is allowed to germinate, grow, and develop. So another study that I want to mention, because I know some of you probably do have concerns about this, and this was a 10-year herbicide study. This was also done by the Forest Service out of our Northern Forest Research Station in Irvine, Pennsylvania. This was a 10-year site preparation study. It was conducted following shelterwood site prep treatment. So it was just like what I showed you there, the stand prior to cut being shelterwood cut was treated with a herbicide through the understory. They found that the herbaceous community was quite resilient to the herbicides using a tank mix of glyphosate, for example, Roundup, or sulfometuron, for example, oust. The impact of a single application of a herbicide on the herbaceous plant community was short-lived. They found that no species was lost from any one of the research sites over the 10-year study. And species diversity actually improved. So dominance by hay-scented fern and other browse-resistant species was reduced. And so when they reduced that dominance by these browse-resistant species, they didn't eliminate those species, but what they found was that diversity over that 10-year time frame, particularly inside a deer fence, just greatly increased. They also looked at these same study sites for a couple of wildlife species as well. So small mammals they found also increased. Mice increased, but shrews decreased. After 2 to 4 years, they didn't see any effect. Birds, they did find that the richness and abundance of birds decreased initially until the return of that vertical structure. So the vertical structure is that structure that you lose from the ground layer up to about 20 feet. So that was eliminated with the herbicide spray. So once that returned after 4 or 5 years with fencing, they found that the bird richness and abundance actually returned. Salamanders, they found no effect with the herbicide, but they did see an initial reduction in impact in the first year, and they attributed that to the increased sunlight, drying that leaf litter layer on the forest floor, actually causing a decrease in the salamander population. But ultimately, over time, they didn't find any effect from the herbicide. So again, with any type of pesticide application, and we're dealing with herbicides here, but always read and follow the label before applying. And again, that's the findings with the glyphosate products, is that the label is the law. So follow the label. If you're following the label, you're minimizing your risk to you, your risk to the environment. And I want to acknowledge these folks here, Steve Horsley and Todd Ristow in particular from the U.S. Forest Service Northern Research Station in Irvine, Pennsylvania. for the tremendous amount of work that they did. I know there were a lot of folks involved in that work as well that I'm probably not mentioning here, but I want to thank those folks for their great work and allowing me to use a lot of that in this slide presentation. Here's a source of information that you can get virtually everything that I presented to you today. This is one of my forest science fact sheets called Controlling Understory Fern Competition for Regeneration Success. All of those rates and dates and so forth that the Forest Service study showed are in this fact sheet, and you can find that on the Penn State Extension website. And I'll leave you with this quote here. So the objective of herbicide use in forestry is not to achieve the complete weed control routine as in row crop agriculture, but rather to provide a temporary growth advantage, months to a few years, for the crop trees over their competition. So don't think about forestry as row crop agriculture. Really what we're trying to do with our herbicide treatments is to just create this temporary window so that what we're trying to grow has an advantage. And it might only be an advantage for a few months or a few years, but if we can give these species that advantage, reduce that deer impact, and get that window that we need to get them established and get them growing, that's really what our objective is. And so with that, I'll leave you with this image here. So this was one of our fern demonstration sites. And you can see this is my, my friend Mike Barton. He's one of our consulting foresters here. We controlled the fern here just using a glyphosate herbicide. This is what it looked like before we treated it. The understory is just an absolute carpet of black cherry seedlings. This is a high elevation plateau site. Great black cherry site actually, and that seed was there in the soil just waiting to be released. And once we removed that dense low shade, this is year 2, we just had a carpet of new tree seedlings ready to go. So with that, Pete, that's all I have, and if we have any questions, I'll be happy to take them.
Dave, great job. As always, this is super. And I'd like to so Dave made reference to a couple of his publications, and Dave does a great job with publications. It's where I always start when I'm looking for something written. I think when you exit the webinar, you'll be shown a link to what was called our Cornell Forest Connect Ning site, which is a social media site. I'll open up a blog there and post links to Dave's publications. So if you didn't keep track of those, so Dave's showing that screen right now. So I'll open up. Or if Dave has free time, I'll let him write a blog.
No, I'll let you do that, Pete.
I think when you first came out with your Fern publication, I started a blog on that. So I'll just I'll update that, but go to that site if you want to look for the aggregate of the publications.
Yeah, it opened on my screen after I logged on, Pete. So that's what opened.
So, good. So it worked like it was supposed to.
Yes.
So there are lots of comments, and I don't know. Do you want to look at the chat window, or do you want me to read them to you, or what's the best?
I'll let you facilitate, Pete, if you don't mind.
Sure. So let's see. So Janine wants to know if any of the ferns are edible.
I don't know the answer to that question.
They're like fiddleheads, and I've had them, but I don't remember which of the ferns produce the fiddleheads. So maybe if somebody in the audience knows the answer, they can type that into the chat window.
Yeah, I don't know. Oh, ostrich fern, somebody's saying there.
So, and then Philip asked a question that I initially responded to, but I told him that I'd let you respond as well. He wants to know if goats can be used to control ferns, and if goats will eat tree seedlings.
Well, Pete, what did you find with your study there? I know you had meat goats in woods.
Yeah, and that was my response was based on that, was that goats will certainly eat the tree seedlings. If you have them at a high enough density, they'll eat the undesirable or the non-palatable species as well. But goats usually don't eat ferns. There's a chemical in ferns, I don't remember the name of it, that interferes with the absorption of nutrients. So if the deer or the goats eat the ferns, they're less able to absorb nutrition from other things that they eat. I'm guessing that may be why deer avoid it as well, beyond the fact that there's just nothing of nutritional quality in a fern. So the answer is no, goats won't work, and yes, goats eat tree seedlings.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's unfortunate. I mean, goats will eat our desirable stuff. I mean, I think some of your studies showed that they were taking down some of the striped maple and things like that, but I'm not sure goats are the answer. Very expensive fencing, moving goats in and out. It's kind of a temporary fix. And I know with invasive plants too, a lot of folks are fond of goats, but I've seen where they just browse them down, you move the goats out, and the plants just sprout back up.
Yeah, there has to goats work if you do it correctly, but doing it correctly is not a kind of once and done effort. So Philip asked about, and I think you did answer this, but just to be explicit, does successive applications of Roundup affect the soil as to prohibit seedling growth?
So I'd say first off, we would not likely do successive applications. So my hope would be that you could get away with one broadcast application and maybe follow up on misses or some invasives that might come in later on with a spot treatment. But glyphosate binds to soil particles, so it doesn't move off site and it's not taken up by root system. And then over time, it has a relatively short half-life as well, very similar to what I described with sulfometuron. And it's weather dependent, but over time, it is broken down by microbes in the soil. So fungi, bacteria, things like that, to organic acids that naturally occur. So over time, it's not something that bioaccumulates in animal systems if they ingest anything that they're eating, and it doesn't build up in soil because it's organically broken down.
Okay, I think that's a good point. You made at the closing. You talked about the distinction between row crop agricultural use of herbicides, and I have no knowledge of that, so I'm not commenting about that. But the distinction is that in forestry, on any given acre, you might do an herbicide treatment once in a, let's say a 50-year window, and maybe it's twice in a 50-year window, but it's distinctly different, timing of applications as to what is commonly thought of about herbicide treatments.
Yeah.
So Guy says that Roundup has been found to impact pollinators, and wonders if there is an impact on pollinators where glyphosate is used to control ferns.
So my thought is, if we look at understories like we see pictured there, that probably has a greater impact on any woodland pollinators than a one-time application of glyphosate, which, whereas if we look at this, this 10-year study here, where we're now able to reduce fern dominance and other browse-resistant species dominance, and we're increasing species diversity, I think that's going to be to our benefit. I think a lot of the issues that we see around glyphosate and pollinators relates directly to, and I'll say this, it's more of our clean farming practices. We're trying to feed people on fewer acres, and we have these Roundup ready crops now. So our farm fields, and they need to be this way to produce the crop, but we're eliminating a lot of plants that our pollinators used to use. For example, I live right adjacent to cornfields and soybean fields, and I know that the milkweed gets blasted that ever tries to edge out into those fields. And so I think that's a lot of the issues that we're seeing. It's not the glyphosate itself, it's the loss of habitat that we're seeing. And so, you know, what we're trying to do is actually create better habitat by creating that plant diversity in our understories by eliminating that fern dominance. So I would say what we're doing is going to benefit pollinators in the long run. The short-term impacts might be there, but in the long term, I think it's going to be beneficial.
Okay. The next question's from Lou. This is when you were talking about mode of action of glyphosate, and he wants to know what's the mode of action, and you didn't address this, but he's talking about a cut surface or a cut stump treatment. What's the mode of action when you apply glyphosate to a freshly cut stump if there's no chlorophyll there?
Yeah, interesting question. So it still inhibits those amino acids, but I don't know the answer to that question. That is a very good question. I guess I've never had that question before, Peter. I haven't thought about it.
I had neither, but I guess I would assume that that the effect is that it moves. So glyphosate is mobile like in beech trees, it's mobile through the root system to remaining root suckers, and it moves to the foliage. So it's moved within the tree to the point where there is chlorophyll. But that's
Although, if you had an individual stem like a maple or a birch that you cut, or well, if you cut it off, you don't have any leaf surface anymore. So I'm not sure, but I know of course, the mode of action is its inability to build those proteins, those amino acids that are found in those plants, inhibit its ability to build those proteins. So I think there's something there as well, and obviously they must be found in root systems as well, because it's very effective at preventing stumps from resprouting.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Good point. Christina wants to know if ferns provide erosion control benefits when they grow on slopes or embankments.
Oh, I would say absolutely. I mean, I would have no doubt that if you had a fern cover like that you would be preventing erosion control. And if that was your objective, I would say it's probably very effective at that. And you might like the appearance of it even.
Right.
And on the wintertime, remember, it's brown and down in the wintertime. It just has this ugly brown mat, so that may not give you the aesthetics and what you need, but certainly protecting the soil.
Okay. Irene wants to know if ferns are native.
Yes, the ferns that I have named today, even the clump ferns that I mentioned, all of those ferns are native as far as I understand.
Joe wants to know if there are more areas impacted by fern without deer browse, or is there generally a correlation between the two? I'm not sure I really understand.
Yeah, the level of browsing, certainly, the level of impact, we'll say, does increase fern abundance. So in areas where you have fern, there's definitely a direct correlation between high deer impact and high fern abundance. So this site you're looking at here in this picture here, tremendously high deer impact in that area. And we wouldn't have the fern abundance if the deer impact was lessened.
Okay. All right.
I mean, that's really important to note, folks, because this is a native plant. And when you see it completely out of balance, like you're seeing in some of these pictures here, this is not a normal situation. I mean, go back to this slide here. I mean, this one here, that I have demonstration fences out on this site. And the only places I was able to grow trees were inside those fences. So the deer impact is a tremendous part of this equation.
Dave, if you put a fence up without treating the fern, so if you went into the stand as we see it on the screen, and just put up a fence, would that be enough to allow, or do you have to control, is there a legacy effect of the ferns that what's your guess on that?
Yeah, so that's exactly what they showed in those studies, Pete. Those studies that I showed you the charts from, I don't know if I want to go back that far in the presentation, but those
You
charts
don't have to.
were inside fences. And so keep that in mind. This was, reduction of seedling numbers and seedling height growth without deer. And so that's what's telling to me about fern, is that this happens even inside fences, if you don't control the fern. So seedling numbers and seedling height growth is tremendously reduced. Now, that being said, I think over time, and it might take decades inside a fence, or might take 5 to 10 years, you might get rubus eventually and some other things like birch and stuff growing up through that eventually does shade out the fern. But it takes much longer than what would be if you controlled that fern with a herbicide, especially a selective herbicide like sulfometuron initially.
Right. Okay. Kelly wants to know, and she has a couple of questions that we'll bounce back and forth to, but so she wants to know, how long does it take for the ferns, and I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit. If she does a treatment on ferns, how long does it take for the ferns to die before she could go in with equipment and not have to worry about the tire, the track breaking up the rhizomes? Is there, what's kind of like, how quickly do the ferns die?
Yeah, we usually would probably give you a recommendation of just wait like 30 days or until you see symptoms. So if you start to see yellowing from the herbicide treatment, it's effective. But typically we're going to say about 30 days. It's been able to translocate through that plant to the root system, and it's doing its job. And so now it's done its job. But you might even see symptoms before that. So if you see symptoms, the plant's beginning to wilt, you're starting to see coloration change, it's done what it's going to do, and you can go do whatever you need to do at that time. So if you see it even prior to 30 days, it's been effective, and you can do whatever you need to do there.
So related to that, maybe you could reiterate under what circumstances you would use glyphosate, when you would use oust, and when you'd use both.
Yep, so we had that summary slide here, so let me bring that up here. That was this one here. So site-specific recommendation. So most situations, you're going to have a combination of herbaceous interference like fern, grass, sedge, a seed bank, Japanese stilt grass, as well as woody plants like striped maple, beech brush, ostraya, or eastern hop hornbeam. So you're looking at most situations, it's a combination of glyphosate and sulfometuron. So the 1 to 1.5 quarts plus the 2 ounces of sulfometuron combined in a tank mix applied per acre. Ferns only, sulfometuron works fantastic, very selective to hardwood seedlings and conifer seedlings, but it will take out broadleaf plants. So you got to be aware of that. If you have desirable herbaceous broadleafs, wildflowers, things like that, it's likely going to take those out as well, because it treats annual and perennial grasses and broadleaf herbaceous plants. So if you have grass and sedge seed banks, Japanese stilt grass is one we're dealing with here constantly. Short husk grass is one they dealt with a lot on the Allegheny Plateau. Then you can use the sulfometuron or a combination of the glyphosate and sulfometuron. If you have hardwoods and just hardwoods, no beech brush or no ferns, just use glyphosate, and you can be effective at controlling beech and striped maple with just using glyphosate.
Is it safe to assume that where you have these heavy fern and grass covers that result from high deer impacts, that you typically do not have very many of those wildflowers, trilliums, and whatever?
It's pretty typical, Pete, in my experience, that if I have that kind of dense fern understory, there's almost nothing else there. Most of those places, as I alluded to in my opening slide, are, they're just biological deserts. They just don't have that plant diversity there. So
Right.
that's what you're dealing with. It looks
Right.
nice, but you don't have it. You don't have wildlife habitat. You don't have plant diversity, and ultimately, like I said, you're threatening the sustainability of the forest, but because we can't get seedling regeneration. So even in a site like this, if you just reduce the deer impact, the legacy effect is that this might be an altered permanent state. How do you get rid of that fern? It doesn't just go away over time. So without some kind of treatment, this could be an altered permanent state. And a lot of scientists have alluded to these kinds of things from decades of overabundance of deer, or deer just above what the carrying capacity is.
Right. Okay. Philip wants to know, when you talked about 1 to 1.5 quarts of glyphosate per acre. How much water do you mix that with?
It totally depends. So number one, if you were calibrating through my fact sheet, which for your backpack sprayer, whether you're using a mist blower or whether you're just using a backpack sprayer, the amount of water is based on your calibration. So it's based on your pressure that you're pumping your tank up to. It's based on the kind of nozzle that you have. It's based on how you like to spray, how fast you can walk through fern. So it's going to tell you how much water you're actually putting out when you calibrate. So the same thing applies to these people using mechanized equipment. They have to actually apply on these areas, these open areas, like you saw where Barry Rose was looking like this. This is because he was calibrating that machine, and so the only way he knows is to set the pressure, use the given nozzles that he's doing, and going out applying to a fixed area. And then it says, okay, based on that amount you apply to that fixed area, that's how much solution you're applying per acre. And if you're applying that much solution per acre, here's how much herbicide needs to be in that solution. So the calibration is what tells you the amount of water that you're putting out. And then in that water is the herbicide is mixed into that water, is part of that. So you have to calibrate. These might be 50 gallons per acre that they're putting out. I know people that have gone as low as 10 gallons per acre on their solution. The lower you can go, the more concentrated it is with herbicide, and the less often you have to come back to your truck and fill up. So if I can get my calibration where I can now go out and I can spray 10 gallons to the acre, I don't have to come back to my truck and fill up my tank as often, but I'm still putting that 2 quarts or that 2 ounces or that 1.5 quart or whatever the rate is per acre out. It doesn't matter if I put it out in 10 gallons or if I put it out in 200 gallons, I'm still putting the same amount of herbicide out there.
Okay. Teresa wants to know, if you do like small clear cuts as a wildlife opening, let's say an acre in size, do you still need to treat the fern, or will it die in the full sun?
No, the full sun will actually promote it. So you'll see once you open fern up, it's very shade tolerant, but once you open it up to light, it just gets super dense, and it will be waist high in places, very difficult to walk through because you can't see the ground. And no, you would want to treat those areas as soon as you can after cutting, or prior to cutting would be ideal if you knew where they were going to go.
Okay. Walter wants to know if sulfometuron interferes with animal metabolism.
Now, sulfometuron is another one of these products that has the super high toxicity rating. And so it's also greater than 5,000 milligrams per kilogram. So the toxicity
So
rating, go ahead.
clarify what you mean by that.
Yeah,
No,
so
because
the
what you mean by because that
so
sounded bad, but I don't think.
they use a rating called the LD50 value. And that's the lethal dose value. And all these herbicides and pesticides are tested on rodents, typically rats in a laboratory, to come up with what the lethal dose rating is. And so with both glyphosate and sulfometuron, the LD50 value, or the lethal dose value, is greater than 5,000 milligrams of pesticide per kilogram of body weight for the test subject, in this case, rats. And so that's literally the highest toxicity rating that you can have for a pesticide. It's off the chart. We just know that it's greater than 5,000 milligrams per kilogram. We don't know what it is. So um, oust or sulfometuron, Roundup, glyphosate have these really, really, I'll say low, in the sense that they're just non-toxic. It actually gives them a rating of being practically non-toxic.
Okay. Um, let's see. I'm just trying. Okay, so Lanny says, what sort of work is being done to control the deer to prevent ferns from taking over? Wants to know if hunting programs or culling of populations where there's high deer impact is useful.
Yeah, great question. Of course, the deer are owned by this individual states. And so the states set the regulations, they set the seasons, they set the bag limits. Individual landowners own the property. And so they can restrict access, they can restrict doe harvesting, they can restrict buck harvest to older deer, whatever. So even though the state owns the deer and sets the regulations, we still have a lot of issues because the deer are ultimately on private property. And we have no control to say, okay, I don't care the deer on your land. We need you to kill more deer. And so you can do everything you can on your land, but if your neighbor's not managing the deer population, you could have the spillover effect and still have really high deer impact. So oftentimes that's where we run into programs, and one that we have here, and I'm pretty sure New York has a very similar program called the Deer Management Assistance Program, which allows private landowners to apply for and receive additional antlerless tags that are good through any of the regular hunting seasons on that individual property. So that's a helpful tool. Does New York have something similar to that, Pete?
Yes, yep, exactly. It's also called DMAP,
Yep.
and landowners, there are minimum acreages and specific ownership objectives that are necessary in order to secure those particular permits.
Yep. So beyond just our regular seasons and bag limits, the regular tags that you can get as a hunter, you could apply for DMAP to get additional antlerless tags for that property. And beyond that, then we move into things like fencing, or some of the research that Pete's involved with now, the slash walls, to protect our harvest sites to get regeneration. And so if you can't control the deer through hunting and through programs like DMAP, then you have to look at some of these other means to try to reduce that impact and regenerate forests. I mean, that's the whole idea behind this. That's the sustainability part of it that's lacking. And, keep in mind, it's not just that these are human caused disturbances. We need to be able to regenerate forests even in natural disturbances. Trees die, trees blow over from storms and whatnot. If we need to be able to replace those trees still. And I've seen areas where that doesn't happen. They turn into fern meadows.
Kelly has a question about, it's kind of like the sequence of operations. If you do a site preparation treatment using sulfometuron, will that decrease the abundance of rubus following the harvest. And I'm wondering what that would also do to species like pin cherry or other, so the oust or the sulfometron doesn't affect hardwood seedlings that are established, but does it limit their um, germination?
So Rubus or blackberry and raspberry briars are not tolerant of sulfometuron, and so that
That's
was one.
as a foliar
Yes, that's
treatment.
going to be foliar, Peter. I don't know the impact. So remember, we're applying these during the growing season. So if we're controlling fern, we're July to September until fern yellowing starts to occur. So we have that window. Well, actually, I think with sulfometron even went into October before we saw fern yellowing. So we're applying these as growing season. So Rubus has leaves on it when we're applying, and we're going to control existing plants. Now, it's somewhat tolerant because Rubus has a more woody stem. I've seen it rebound actually at low, 2-ounce rates and seen Rubus come back. But at the higher rates, you're going to kill Rubus. I don't know what it does to the seed bank, and I don't know that was ever actually studied. Same with pin cherry and some of these other species. These are studies that looked at advanced regeneration. So these seedlings were present on the site at the time of application. And so my gut feeling is that we're not impacting hardwood seed banks, but that has never been studied.
So you said that you saw effectiveness of dormant season treatments to stilt grass.
Yes. Yeah, so if you have stilt grass issues, I've seen, and that's the general prescription actually, are dormant seasons. So before bud break on desirable seedlings, you're putting the treatment out, and then that grass is germinating. It's picking up the herbicide from the soil. This Japanese stilt grass is an annual grass.
Right. So I guess it's the question of grasses versus hardwoods.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because I've talked to our weed scientists, and we don't understand the mechanism. If you ever really study herbicides, they're either control seed germination, they control grasses, they control broadleaves, which are can be herbaceous or woody, or they're selective to conifers. So why is oust leaving hardwoods but taking out broadleaf herbaceous stuff? So we don't understand the chemistry behind it, and he can't explain it to me. So yeah, I don't know why that is. So why does it leave all these hardwood seedlings you see listed on the table or on the computer there, but take out broadleaf herbaceous plants? So that's not the way almost every other herbicide works.
Okay. All right.
So yeah, I don't know the answer what it's going to do to a seed bank of pin cherry or a seed bank of Rubus. It hasn't been studied.
I would find that helpful. I may have to do some little pilot plots and see what's going to go on with that. Okay.
Yeah, you have to have a control that you saw it come up. Yeah, so it would be hard to measure because you wouldn't really know whether you had the seed there or not. It'd have to be a very controlled study where you put seed and almost did it in a laboratory.
Right. Okay, so I'm sensitive to your time window here, Dave. So let me, I'll try to stop adding to the questions. So Joe and Colin are asking about. So Joe made a statement that promoting Rubus is a double-edged sword. At one level, you could be replacing one problem with another, and he's seen situations where Rubus has interfered with regeneration, and also that he's not seen deer browsing to impact Rubus. And so that's the double-edged sword, and Colin is wanting to know if you can kind of expand on this. And I have areas where Rubus, I think, is interfering with hardwoods inside slash walls. And so just like, where's the balancing point between enough Rubus to suppress the fern, but maybe not too much Rubus, or maybe it's You have to
Yeah, and
track
is it really
over,
under,
over the shade.
is it under your control? You know, is there something we can really do about it? And I'd be curious what Ralph Nyland's take would be on this from SUNY, because there's always been my understanding that Rubus is kind of a part of that natural regeneration process. And if we typically see a lot of Rubus initially, but then over time we do get hardwood seedlings through that naturally. But you know, I've been working down here for 19 years, over 19 years now, and I've never seen a Rubus issue. So we just have too many deer. There's many properties where I can't even find a blackberry briar growing on it. So I honestly can't answer the question, Pete. You probably would have way more experience than I have with Rubus.
Well, so we see in areas, I don't think we have I keep telling myself we don't have as much of a deer problem as you have.
Thank God.
So inside the slash wall, we have Rubus that is 8 to 10 feet tall and that you can't push your way through. Outside the slash walls, the Rubus is only 4 or 5 feet tall and you can usually push your way through it. So I think the deer are having an impact. And it's obviously very sensitive to shade. So if there's some kind of, I don't know how you would write a prescription for this, but where we have basal areas that are in the 50 to 60 square feet per acre, we don't get a lot of Rubus development. And we're not getting maybe not getting as much fern, but I don't know that we had fern there to begin with. So I think there's 3 pieces going on. There's overhead shade that will limit Rubus eventually. There's the Rubus that may limit the fern, and then there's the deer that may limit the Rubus. So
I think what we see here, and what the point we were trying to make here in my talk, was that over time, if you have fern, you've let in light, and the deer impact is low, that we've seen fern eventually grow through the fern and eventually shade it out and outcompete it. They're both native plants, so it's very typical to see them on the same sites where you've let in light. And if the deer is more in balance, they don't become an issue.
Right.
But yeah,
okay,
it's a good question.
So Scott wants to know if killing the ferns and replacing it with plants that deer eat, whether or not that will increase the deer population because of less starvation.
Yeah. Well, you're certainly creating habitat. You know, habitat is food, habitat is cover. And so that plant diversity, it just means that you have to continue to harvest the appropriate number of antlerless deer, female deer, to keep the population in check. And so that's monitoring those sites to see what the impact is and what the browsing level is on preferred species. So you'd have to really just keep an eye on things.
Okay. If I talked about 2 primary, excuse me, 2 primary chemicals, glyphosate and sulfometuron, what impact do those have on white pine seedlings? This is from Andy.
Yeah, so we grow very few, and I don't know the answer. I'm pretty sure now there's a rate that you can actually release pines with both of those herbicides, particularly late summer, where white pine has set its resting bud and is no longer elongating that new candle of growth. But I don't know the rate, but I'm sure if you also took glyphosate and just sprayed a white pine down, that you'd likely kill it. I don't think
yes, you will.
I don't think you could do that with the sulfometron. So there's a rate. You'd have to check the label. I don't have the release rates in my head, but there are conifer release rates on both label, which means it can go over the top of white pine late in the summer once it's set its resting bud and is now basically dormant until growth begins the next spring.
So I have not done a full-blown dose response curve with glyphosate. There was one occasion when I tried half a dozen plots that were full of white pine seedlings, like 12-inch tall white pine seedlings, and and whatever dose I used at whatever season, I had really good control of white pine. So I know there's a wrong way to do it. I can verify that.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's something you got to be really cognizant of. And I would check the herbicide labels to see that white pine is listed for conifer release, it would be called, and what that rate, that recommended rate is. And a lot of times, honestly, for conifer release, we use another herbicide. Active ingredient would be imazapyr. And so if you're really looking to release white pines and control hardwoods, you might want to look at imazapyr as well.
Okay. So here's a question. They want to know whether or not Penn State receives funding from Monsanto, or now it would be Bayer.
I have no idea, and I don't. I know that. And actually, the products that I've listed most often are a Corteva product, which used to be DuPont.
Okay. And a lot of that research was also done by the Forest Service, which, as I understand, is largely internally funded.
Oh yeah, yeah. All the studies that I showed today, that's all Forest Service. And at that time, Roundup was the only glyphosate product available because it was still on patent. Once it came off patent, every company under the sun is now making a glyphosate product. The only difference being, and that's something that people have to be cognizant of, is that not all glyphosates are labeled for forest use. And so you have to pick a glyphosate that's actually labeled for use in forests, and not all of them are. So you have to be careful of that. You can't just go down to the farm store and buy glyphosate and go put it out in your woods. It would be illegal unless it had forests on the label.
Right. Okay, Neil wants to know if hunting will ever be able to bring deer populations down to an ecologically appropriate level.
So in our state, the way we are organized, I will say it's going to be a real difficult challenge unless we reorganize, because we're one of only 2 states that our seasons and bag limits are set by commissioners rather than an environmental organization that's state funded. And our entity is entirely funded by the sale of hunter licenses. In states where you have, like New York, where you have a department of environmental conservation that is in charge of not just forests, but also wildlife and many other things that are environment related, I think it is a real possibility, because biologists are setting those regulations. In my state, our regulations are set by commissioners who are all hunters, and the decisions are all driven by hunters. And seldom are our biologists listened to very much. And so my state is very challenging, and it's one of only 2 states that's set that way. So the answer to that question is, I think, is yes. And I think if you look at some states that have very liberal seasons and very liberal bag limits, I think it's very possible. I lived in Virginia for 8 years, where we hunted deer from October 1 till early January. And when you bought your license, you got 5 tags. And if you filled those, you could go buy some more. I had no problems with deer whatsoever, and killed more hardwood trees releasing loblolly pine than I've probably seen in my 20-year career here in Pennsylvania. So yeah, it's definitely feasible, just with regular season and bag limits.
Okay. There's a couple of questions related to garlic mustard. One that I promoted when I said that we'd only be doing these treatments once or twice every 50 years. So first part of the question is whether Roundup is effective on garlic mustard before flowering, and also maybe what you know about the frequency of herbicide applications, over the period of decades, because of some herbaceous invasive. So when you get into the whole invasives category, are you going to have more frequent herbicide treatments?
Yeah.
2-part question.
Yeah, let me answer the second part, because when I remember. invasives have changed things entirely. So, you know, when we were looking, or this, I'll say we, actually the Forest Service looking at these studies, these were typically, you know, one-time application per 80 to 100-year rotation. You established the regeneration and you walked away from it. Invasive plants have entirely changed that. So you could do the one-time application to control native plants, fern, striped maple, beech brush, for example, and then have all kinds of invasive issues occur just because you let light in and birds are transporting seeds, or seeds come in on logging equipment and whatnot. So now you're dealing with something that might require, you know, periodic revisits, maybe even annually for a period of time to control invasives. So that has entirely changed that, that outlook. So, and what was the second question, part of that? I guess it was the first part of that question.
I'll give you the first part, but I want to add on to that. I think
Okay.
that we need to learn more about how those invasive. So I agree with what you're saying, although I wonder if that pattern might be different in the absence of deer. So inside our slash walls, we have a few scattered invasive shrubs established. But when I look at the height growth of advanced regeneration, you know, after 4 years, we have what were small seedlings, you know, like a few inches prior to harvest, are now 5 feet tall. So, so it may be that in the absence of deer, you still have to do some type of control for the invasive plants, but maybe not with the same frequency as you would in the absence of deer, or in the presence of deer, excuse me.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the first part of the question was, how do you use glyphosate to control garlic mustard? Can you use it early in the season so you can avoid some of the effects on pollinators?
So we can actually use a different herbicide that's selective to broadleaf plants and be very effective at controlling garlic mustard even in the dormant season. So when you see that first stage of garlic mustard, you'll see it'll retain its leaves through the winter. And so we can come out in early, in the very, very early growing season, even before emergence of other native plants, and put down a product called triclopyr. The active ingredient is triclopyr, or 2,4-D, which is a contact herbicide with no soil activity. And so it only targets what you treat. And you can take out that garlic mustard before you even have other plants emerging. And so it's very target specific because of that window that garlic mustard gives you before it bolts into that second year. So we have a new fact sheet out on that you can find on our website, which gives those recommendations for you. So that's the selective post-emergence. So before it flowers, or very early in that growing season before other plants emerge, you can treat it with broadleaf herbicides like triclopyr and 2,4-D and get rid of it. Very, very target specific if you're worried about other pollinator plants being present.
Okay, just skimming down through. So Kelly has lots of questions. I think I'll just have, Kelly knows how to get a hold of me, and I can put her in touch with you. But I'm sensitive. So just so everybody knows, Dave has a 2-hour webinar he has to give mid-afternoon, and then he comes back here at 7. So he's going to want lunch in here at some point. All right, so it looks like there's just lots of people saying great presentation. So, which I would add to that. So, Dave, awesome job, and the audience was like awesome questions. So this was a great time. I appreciate everybody's input.
Yeah, thank you, folks. Appreciate listening in and hanging in there. We still